Who is responsible for the dire state of South Africa's economy? Does the South African state and its social partners of business and labor have the will and the bravery to take the required bold decisions for a fundamental economic change? Or for the next 30 years, will South Africa continue to be subjected to the same narratives that have so far had little impact on the lives of the majority? Good evening, my name is Sizwe Mpofu Walsh, and welcome to another episode of Unfiltered. Joining us to dissect the state of South Africa's economy are Elias Munache, Black Business Council President, Finance Portfolio Committee member Dennis Ryder, and Provincial Secretary General of COSATU, Tony Ehrenreich. Before we dive into our debate this evening, let's watch the scene setter produced by Jacqueline Mapala.
To address the issue of the economy and to get all social partners to work together on issues that are pertinent to the growth of our economy.
Speaking to the media during the ANC's National Executive Council meeting this weekend, President Cyril Ramaphosa conceded that South Africa's economy is ailing partly because of the many reforms that were supposed to be implemented years ago were not done. Last week, Labour Federation COSATU embarked on a Section 77 socio-economic strike, drawing the attention of the state and the business sector to the struggles of workers and the majority of South Africans who've had to survive under the ailing economy. While the business sector believes that the state only has to create a conducive environment for the private sector to thrive, it has also been accused of failing to invest significantly in the economy and to create employment. And in a country where jobs are hard to come by, the labour sector has also faced criticism for failing to recognise the changed economic circumstances and insisting on rigid labour laws where flexibility is required to lessen the barriers for businesses.
Every time COSATU calls on action, the comments that come through is that, are you sure this is the right time because the economy is not doing well? We ask this question, whose economy are we talking about? Because the same reason that makes us to raise these issues, it is because the economy is not working for us.
But more calls have been made for the state to intervene directly in the economy to ensure the required structural reforms, including changing the Reserve Bank's mandate to focus on employment creation rather than inflation targeting, seen as being out of context with a developing state that must correct the triple challenges of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. Since the dawn of democracy, the government, business, and labour sectors have met under the cooperative structure of the National Economic Development and Labour Council to negotiate and agree on policies relating to the country's finance and monetary policy, trade and industry, labour and development policies. But it has been seen mainly as weak and unable to make a real impact on the economy. Observers continue to blame the government for lacking the courage to enforce its ruling party, the ANC's resolutions on economic transformation in order to reverse the historical impact of a racially skewed economy, for fear of capital flight and disturbing the long-established wealth pattern that excludes the majority from participating in the economy. The recent employment equity figures show that 62% of top management positions are still held by white people, as opposed to 16% of blacks. In 2021, the country already experienced what observers say was an explosion of a ticking time bomb, where many engaged in widespread looting and property destruction after many years of suffering economic exclusion and abject poverty. The state's National Development Plan of 2030 aims to, among others, increase economic growth and reduce poverty to 2030. But with the many challenges of crime, corruption, and an incapable state, especially at local level, which is at the culpus of service delivery for citizens and businesses to thrive, there is no telling when or whether South Africa will ever come out of the economic doldrums it's currently facing. Jacqueline Mapala, Unfiltered, SABC.
Welcome back. The economy is no doubt in dire straits. Who's to blame for this? Mr. Ehrenreich, let me start with you. COSATU recently had a big rally, but some blame Labour for labour market inflexibility. They say you're to blame for not allowing the economy to be as dynamic as it could be. Are you, as Labour and COSATU, to blame for the economy's dire state? And if not you, then who?
Good evening, and my apologies. Load shedding, which I think is one of the biggest challenges affecting our economy, just affected me, so I missed part of the introductory session, but no worries.
No problem. We're all used to it by now, sadly.
Yes, no, we have to. It's part of the operational requirements. But the debates in South Africa always is ourselves blaming business and business blaming us. That's the narrative that unplays all of the time. And we've got to be better than that. We've got to be bigger than that if we are to find solutions to respond to the challenges that exist in our society. But I think that the fundamental fault line in South African society at the moment is that we have these elites that stole and enriched themselves under apartheid, continues to do that with their cronies who are the new black emerging elites aligning themselves with them. And together they're building an economy that's excluding the majority of people and certainly working families.
But to what extent, just on that, is COSATU enmeshed in that elite politics, whether through holding companies with its affiliates, whether through politicians who are or have been affiliated with COSATU, and indeed its alliance with the ANC? Aren't you actually part of that elite political and economic problem?
Well, let's understand the problem about elitism for what it is. There's no doubt some unionists who've enriched themselves, and I'm not here to bat for them. I'm here to bat for a working class labor movement that's meant to make sure we build a more equal, a more just, and a more fair society for all of our people. That includes the wealthy to an extent, and this covers both black and white. But what we've seen is that the elites in our society have enriched themselves at the cost of our people. Now just look at what's happened. Steiner, Marcus Jooste, responsible for 280 billion rand. This is not million, this is billion rand that him and his cronies who are yet to be uncovered have stolen or fraudulently contrived with. Since the start of our democracy, we've seen collusion. Collusion is nothing other than a fancy word for theft in the big companies involved in chicken production, building the stadiums, the steel industry, the bread prices, which effectively is stealing out of the mouths of poor people. We've seen what the lawyers have done with the road accident funds, how they're looting that. We see how many of the other sectors of society are continuing to undermine our ability to move the country forward. So if you ask the question, are we part of the elite? Certainly not part of that elite that has their high princes here in Stellenbosch and the rest of them there in Sandton and elsewhere. What we are engaged with is a circumstance where workers earn desperately low salaries, and strikes and wage bargaining is one of the only ways in the South African society that we have some redistribution of the wealth.
Okay,
and remember, the wealth is so concentrated in our country because of apartheid. Apartheid wasn't about white people not liking black people. Apartheid was a system of accumulation where the wealthy, those who benefit from racial discrimination, where they could enrich themselves and amass the wealth to themselves and their establishments.
Okay, and we've heard the opening statement from Mr. Ehrenreich. Mr. Ryder, is the DA, are opposition parties to blame? Some say they've failed to ignite the imagination of voters and thereby allowed the current governing party to mismanage the economy in the process. Are you to blame for the state of the economy? And if not you, then who? And also feel free to engage with some of the opening statements of Mr. Ehrenreich.
Thank you very much, Suzwe. It's very much appreciated. Look, Look, I certainly don't think you can blame the opposition. I think that the majority of the blame here needs to go to government. It is, after all, government that's had a golden opportunity handed to them to start off a clean slate. We had a fantastic goodwill that was brought forward to our country in 1994. And you must never forget that business, the economy, works on trust. And it's trust between labor and business, trust between businesses, and trust between both of those parties with government. And the reality is that for the majority of the 29 years, government has gone out to find new and innovative ways to break that trust at every step that they can find. So we've had policies that have been developed. Some of them were good policies. We've gone from the RDP to the GEAR, to SGISA, to the NDP, and some good ideas in all of those, but poorly executed and backed up by really bad policy decisions along the way, which have really eroded trust in the economy. And I mean, if one looks at the trust that the international community has with the country, it's summed up by your exchange rate. And one only has to have a look at how the rand is currently undervalued. We're all agreeing that the rand is undervalued, but there's a reason for that. People don't want to do business with South Africa.
There's no doubt that the state has its fair burden to share of our problems, but what about business, and particularly big business, which has often been recalcitrant to come to the party, A, in terms of investment sometimes, but B, in terms of questions of transformation and economic inclusion? Don't you think that business also has a part to play here in our malaise?
So I think that business has gone a long way towards extending a hand to government. But once again, you find yourself in a situation where whatever you are going out to do with government, there's a trust deficit. I mean, one of us wrote a song about corruption a few years ago. And, you know, the reality is that if you, as big business, are going out with your checkbook, if you're giving money forward, the reality is that you know that a large proportion of that is going to be frittered away, and end up in the wrong pockets. So again, trust breakdown and then a reluctance to come out and actually invest.
Do be careful, because I might ask you to recite that song at some point and we could be in trouble. Mr. Monache, what's your view of the debate? We've heard two different sides of this. Of course, you sit at an interesting place, the Black Business Council, on the one hand, forwarding the agenda of transformation, but also part of business and the economic private sector. Who's to blame for our current situation? Is it in fact black business, which on the one hand wants to criticize transformation, but on the other hand often partake in the elite politics that Mr. Ehrenreich spoke about? Or if not you, then who?
This is an evening to you and the listeners. I think let's provide a context so that we are aligned. I mean, firstly, post-1994, the economy, the economic patterns and ownership never changed. Post-1994, the economy continued with the minority literally owning everything. Post-1994, we didn't change the patterns of ownership economically. We continued on a false hope that the politicians, they will change the economy because they have the political power. And I'm saying that was a false hope because we thought private business willingly, they will accept and agree to a transformative agenda. And I'm saying those are the mistakes that we made. Government then passes legislations to give effect to a transformative agenda. On the other side, the same white businesses that for many, many, many years, they've accumulated wealth at the back of government tenders and contracts, they continue to make more money than ever before. The same businesses that have accumulated wealth for more than 50, 100 years at the back of government tenders, they started now labeling the young emerging black businesses that they are tender entrepreneurs.
What has black business done to disrupt those patterns? Because there's no doubt those patterns exist. There's no doubt that our history is a horrific one. But we've had 30 years, and in some ways it seems as though black business has failed itself to mobilize itself to be a strong enough bulwark against these continued patterns of inequality.
Not really. I mean, we are having a situation where we are dealing with a stubborn white businesses that because they've accumulated, they have all the resources under the sun. And that's the reason why they've challenged a number of legislation and regulation that deals with transformatory agenda. We've seen in mining, they've challenged what is called once empowered, always empowered. They wanted that provision to be entrenched in our legislation to say, if we have acquired a certain percentage in a mining house, and you exit for whatever reasons, that mining house must then be deemed and defined as a transformator. And that's not the case. The second part, we've also seen in recent past where in tourism, white businesses and various organizations, they've challenged an agenda where the legislation is then suggested to deal with addressing the imbalance of the past in terms of a transformator agenda. And the Black Business Council, we are part and parcel of forging ahead in dealing with those issues.
What about the state? Because that's all well and good, but shouldn't the state then have stepped in, intervened decisively? It feels like with the implementation of these regulations, the state itself is half-hearted, and that just opens the door to those who of course, want to preserve wealth to preserve it.
Sizo, I guess the point that I'm raising is that the starting point, we need then to start from business. Because we move from a false premise that private business, willingly, they will agree to an inclusive an agenda to bring emerging businesses. And I'm saying that was a false hope because nothing will basically happen if we're then to rely on them to do that. The second part of an assumption that we made was that we are all living in South Africa and we are patriotic to the country in terms of forging ahead and addressing the issues at hand in terms of addressing unemployment, addressing the question of equity, addressing various forms of discriminatory practices that we inherited from the apartheid system. And we then continued on that basis that the economy continued to be in few hands, in the minority of the people in the country.
And you believe that certain businesses, certain economic elites were never actually bona fide parties in that agreement? They always were willing to break the agreement?
No, I'm saying they were not willing to share anything with anyone. And I'm saying even now, let's look at the role of media, for an example.
Well, let's on that bombshell,
okay,
let's stop there. We'll continue the debate with Mr. Ehrenreich, Mr. Ryder, and Mr. Monage after this break. And we're also going to open our conversation onto the appropriate role of the state in our economy and what that should be. Don't go anywhere. We're debating South Africa's economy, its dire state, and how we dig ourselves out of this rut. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're debating the state of South Africa's economy, asking who's to blame and thinking how we can chart a course out of our current malaise. Mr. Ryder, you heard some of the responses to your perspective from Mr. Monage. What do you say to the fact that from 1994, there were certain economic elites who decided that they weren't going to play the nation-building game, and they decided that they were going to hold on to their wealth. And that has really been at the heart of so much of the economic inequality, maybe not lack of growth, but that inequality that lies at the base of our society requires someone who has something to make the decision to share it at some point, does it not?
Sure. So, it's difficult for me to speak on behalf of big business, and I wouldn't want to put motives or comments forward on their behalf. But I do think that there has been some really good initiatives that have been put in place. Certainly, I can speak from the financial services sector where I worked for many years. And the fact is that there was a financial services charter that was given good traction, that took good traction. There were shares given to staff members, and there was generally a good acceptance from many big businesses and involvement. We've seen the same replicated in the mining sector as well as other sectors. The reality, though, is that anyone is going to want to find an environment where they will be encouraged and they will have a fertile environment where they can share the fruits of their labor over time. And I think that the government has a specific role to play in this space. So we've spoken about labor, we've spoken about business. They're both playing on a field. And the reality is that that field is the one that needs to be set by government. Now, we go back to the RDP, which was the manifesto of the ANC government in 1994, which already identified the issues around unemployment, poverty, and inequality. They were already identified way back before the 1994 election. You know, in the mid-2000s, that then became really a big slogan that was trotted out, the triple challenges. It was mentioned in the opening slot this evening. But those triple challenges have not been addressed. In fact, we've seen things going the wrong way on all three of those markers. So what that means is that government policies have not been put in place that enable a fair and equitable playing field for the players to get involved, for that wealth to be shared, right, and for workers and business to find common ground where they start to meet each other.
Mr. Monage, how do you respond to that view? And Mr. Ehrenreich will come to you straight after that.
I'm battling to understand what transformation took place in the financial services, because the reality or the fact of the matter is that financial services, banks are still owned by the same. And financial services is not is one of the sectors that is not transformed. We don't have a black bank in the country. They're still owned by the normal suspects, whether it's FNB, Standard Bank, and the list is long. All major banks, they're not owned by any black consortium in any form or shape. The same banks also, what do? They are paying even pensioners, and they're not even including other people in the entire supply chain in terms of an incubation for a transformatory agenda or program. And I'm saying financial services is one of the sectors that is not transformed. You look at insurance companies, you look at and other related sectors in the financial services. And I'm saying that is the huge sector that is not transformed. You look at health sector, it's the same thing. You then look at property businesses or property portfolios. It's still the same big companies. Again, there is a lack of inclusiveness in terms of bringing various companies on board then to do certain things.
Can I ask you on that? Because I think there's no doubt that the pace of transformation across the economy, but also in sectors like the financial services sector, is, shall we say, lackluster. But why haven't black businesses accepted that the approach of asking these sectors to change is not going to work, and actually just gone and started a black-owned bank and gone and started a black-owned property competitor? Is the onus not on black business to actually now just forge ahead and outcompete in the market?
So the requirements is onerous to black emerging companies. And when I'm saying it's onerous is because the requirements for an individual or consortium to start a bank is huge because one of the limitations is around funding that is required then to do that. And by virtue of that, it then becomes a stumbling block. You cannot then move, cannot do anything because you don't have deep pockets. That's the first thing. Secondly, the regulatory framework does not allow individuals and a consortium from the black disadvantaged communities then to come on board because funding is one of the major limitation that is not geared in terms of allowing this thing. The third part of the problem is that if again we then talk about the white businesses willingly allowing black emerging companies then to come on board, it's not going to happen. And you then rely on government to do certain things. And we have seen, even for the past 29 years, if you get a tender, the media and even the counterparts, the companies that historically they've made, created wealth at the back of government contracts or tenders, they're the ones that they start now peddling a particular narrative to say these are black entrepreneurs or black tender entrepreneurs, so that it's like a sway weight. Whereas on the back of their own wealth, they've created from government contracts and government tenders. And I'm saying the playing field is not properly being labeled, and that's part of the problem that we're then faced with.
Mr. Ehrenreich, how do you respond to the debate so far? We've zoomed in on the financial services sector, and that also begs the question around the appropriate role of the state at the moment, particularly in questions of financial services. There's been a lot of talk from the Tripartite Alliance Quarter that we need actually more active state intervention in that sector to boost and create more equity. What's your view on the appropriate balance of state participation in that sector, and are we getting that right, or what changes would you propose there?
Well, I want to take a moment just to respond to the issue about who's responsible for the problems we have in the economy.
Sure, go ahead.
Now, you've had both of the speakers weighed in on this question. Let's remind ourselves about who the other speakers are. Alice Monaghi was an official at the National Union of Metal Workers. He's now a business owner. We welcome that. We are a bit concerned that with the Porsche that he's driving, he appears to just have assimilated himself into the white lifestyles. Mr. Ryder, by his own admission, doesn't know much about the manufacturing sector, but criticizes it. But I'd like to hear what he says specifically are the problems. Because I specifically pointed out 19 different companies and sectors of the economy owned by whites who've corrupted those instances. We haven't even started to touch on the state-owned enterprises like Eskom, Transnet, Portnet, Telkom, Postnet, all of that, where white hands, along with the Guptas and others, have been stealing the money. So the point that we want to make is that this debate must talk about transformation. Transformation is not about putting one or two black millionaires or billionaires alongside the white billionaires, but it's about making sure our country is more fair, more equal, and more just. And the fact that today our society is more unequal than it was in 1994 is the clearest indication that the policies are failing, or those who are setting the policies in place that must be implemented, they are guarding their own interests or doing that for their new white friends or with the deep pockets in business. So the point that I do want to make is that there's been fundamental changes that I think we could have a meaningful conversation about. And the one I'd like to introduce is on the Competition Commission. The 2019 amendments to the Competition Commission's legislation that talks about how do companies get opportunities in sectors that have been dominated by the old apartheid companies. These white companies that today are saying the trust is lacking from the side of black government or black business or black workers, they have been blocking new black entrants. And the examples I can make is to pack the shelves in the big retail stores like Spar and ShopRite and Pick n Pay. They blocked black entrants, whether they're making spices or canned fruits or cool drinks or other areas. They had to battle to get shelf space so that they could compete. It's only when the Competition Commission law changed, an initiative by Minister Ibrahim Patel, that we saw more systemic changes. And that's what we need, a systemic change that makes our country more equal. We don't just need a few black billionaires to stand next to the white billionaires, because all that has brought us is to see that the black billionaires now have their children in the same schools as the white billionaires. They now assimilated into that lifestyle and have forgotten about the job that they meant to do, which is to undo the legacy of apartheid. But Mr. Ryder would know very little about that, the need for changes, because he's been in the government since before 1994. So he's one of the key architects that defended the apartheid institutions. So maybe he can tell us some of the points that Elias Monaghi points out about how corrupt those white businesses were and how there's no real commitment to meaningful change in the country. It's only when we address that that we can respond to the challenges that we see. Thank you.
Sure, let's leave it there for now. We're going to go to a break. I'm aware that you will probably both like to respond to those direct points. We're talking the South African economy and the dire situation in which the economy is in. And we're asking, firstly, who's to blame? And also, how we dig ourselves out of the malaise that we're in. A reminder also that we did reach out to government through the Department of Trade and Industry, and they were unavailable. But I think you'll agree with me that we have a debate which is wide-ranging, fascinating, and important. Let's go to a break and we'll come back with a further segment to discuss the question of transformation in the economy. Welcome back to Unfiltered. The question of who's to blame for South Africa's dire economic state is a heated one, and we're having a no-holds-barred conversation and debate on that very question. Before we went to the break, we heard Mr. Ehrenreich's perspective, and Mr. Monaghi, some personal accusations were made against you. How do you respond to that?
I don't think I should respond to the personal accusation from Tony. They don't have any merits. Firstly, from a business point of view, there are a number of things that we need them to look at. And all the social partners, whether it's government, business, labor, and politicians, we have a role to play, all of us, in the transformatory agenda in terms of changing the patterns of ownership. We have a role to play in the sense that business need them to do certain things different from the past. Equally so, labor, they need them to do things different from the past. And even government, because if we then move from a premise that we want them to do the same thing over and over, we are not going to achieve different results. And I'm saying theories have proven us correct. And the reason why I'm raising that point is because labor, they need them to do things differently in terms of dealing with ownership, the question of equality, the question of that gap between the rich and the poor. They have a role to play. They have a role to play in the economic dispensation and the patterns of ownership. It's not about a paperless shares in a company. They need them to play a meaningful role in terms of addressing the issues at hand. Equally so, government, they have a role to play in addressing the legislative environment so that business need then to operate in a conducive environment. And business, they need also then to come to the party in terms of addressing key specific aspects around ownership, around empowering and skilling employees, so that, including even communities for that matter, so that we then have an equal share to play. And hence I'm saying each and every one in the quadrant, we have a role to play in addressing the economic problems of this country.
Can I ask you on that? I believe you've just been appointed to the board of Transnet. Is that
quite correct?
Is that correct? Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you.
And I think the point that was made was that there's a sense in which one can be linked to public power and also private power, and then one stops being able to criticize the government as vehemently as if one was not in both of those positions. Do you think that's been a problem of black business, to the extent that in some ways the criticism has been muted of the state because there's a kind of overlap sometimes between the state and black business?
Not really. I mean, we have criticized government on a number of issues. I mean, we were the first one to raise the question of energy, for example, the energy crisis that even to this day we still have that crisis or problem. We are one of the organizations that when we advocated for small medium ministry to be created or established. We're an organization that we stood firm in addressing a number of issues where we even raised the notion of a black industrialist program or scheme, and government basically embraced it. We're an organization where we even went to government to say there are constraints in terms of the schemes that were designed. For example, the notion of skin in the game for black industrialists, because it then becomes a barrier for entry, because if, for example, we are then required then to put forward a security over a particular project, and the banks are not going to back it because they don't have the balance sheet. And again, that is a barrier. I'm saying we have sharply raised those issues. We have criticized government with the intention of improving where it lacks certain things.
Mr. Ryder, your response to the debate so far, and also the notion that, being part, I'm not sure, I'm actually not as acquainted with your history as Mr. Ehrenreich, but being part of a previous order disqualifies you from contributing, or your views on transformation are tainted somehow by that. Is that true?
Well, I'm not sure where Mr. Ehrenreich does his research, but the majority of the time between 1994 and now, I've actually not been in government. I was working with corporate and commercial banking, where I spent quite a lot of time assisting customers who were in the manufacturing industry. So I do know a fair amount about manufacturing industries, certainly from a financial point of view. A lot of that time was also spent assisting black businesses growing, as I was in the commercial side where we were dealing with slightly smaller businesses. But aside from the personal jibes, I think Mr. Ehrenreich and I actually agree on more than we disagree on. And the reality is that the playing fields have not been made equal. Now, again, I go back to the issue of trust that I spoke about earlier, and the fact that no business, no person is going to go out and expose themselves in an environment where they're not feeling trust. And one needs to take a look at the environment that's been set, this playing field that's been laid out for us, where there is a trust deficit, because underpinning a market economy are two key factors. The one is, of course, the private property rights, and the other is the rule of law. And there have been direct assaults on both of these issues, totally eroding the trust space, and making sure that government has created an environment where it is incredibly difficult for business to trust government or to trust labor. And it's been made an environment where it's very difficult for labor to trust business, and now government as well. So we're sitting in an environment where no one's prepared to go out any longer. As I said right at the beginning, we started out with a great goodwill. That goodwill has been squandered. And we find ourselves now in an environment where no one's prepared to trust each other. No one's prepared to be the one that extends the hand of friendship to the other first, because we are all too busy looking at how the other people are trying to catch us out.
Mr. Ehrenreich, can we come to you for a response? But can I also put it to you that you've criticized Mr. Monache's car, you've criticized the history of Mr. Ryder, but doesn't the same apply to COSATU, that in fact you have been party to the economic calamity that we face? And so to point fingers at others is also not to appreciate the way that COSATU itself has been muted in its criticism of the state, partly because it's in alliance with the ANC.
But therein lies the issue, is it not? We have to point fingers at each other. We have to remind ourselves about what each other has done and what it is we want to do. We don't want to replace white capitalists with black capitalists. We want to build a more just and equal society where there's representation of all our racial groups at the ownership levels. In the question about employee ownership schemes, outside of 3 of those, the others have been disasters because it's just forced workers to give legitimacy to company, but they haven't actually realized value out of the equity shares that they got. But we can have those discussions in greater detail when we have the debates on that. The point that I want to come to is that what is causing the economic crisis? Part of the challenge is that, as we pointed out, the other areas of failure in many areas of industries, we should also realize that the companies responsible for that and the partnerships that have been formed is largely vested in those who controlled the economy in the old days. But there's a bigger question that confronts us in this idea about a social partnership, because this is what all of the participants are talking about. This is also what our president enjoins us to do. He talks about the fact that we've got to co-create the ideas and the policies that guide industries. So you see master plans now, detailed plans for up to 20 industries of the key industries in South Africa, and already there are significant changes emerging. So we've got to push the government to do that. We fight with the ANC because in many areas where there's been corruption or just lethargy in implementing policies that will change the environment we've found ourselves in, we have no time for those individuals responsible. If they corrupt, they should go to jail. But at the same token, we must also then point fingers at the opposition that is quite useless in this country, and that's why we don't have an emerging alternative, because nothing practical has been put on the table. It seems the only intent is to defend the apartheid privileges. My final point is this one. The world is changing as we squabble in our country. The dollar is not going to be the sovereign reserve internationally anymore if one is to listen to China, Russia, BRICS, and many of the countries on the continent. And that's going to change the global economy significantly. So this notion of just a market economy that Mr. Ryder introduces to us as if it's a holy grail, that must be seen for what it is. Where's the fastest growing economy at the moment? In China. Who has the most functional state-owned enterprises that are probably the top 50 of the Fortune 500 companies? So the economy is changing as we talk. Artificial intelligence is redefining how industries operate. We're not even talking about how we prepare ourselves for that. We're squabbling how can the rich people take a few cents from the one to the other. But in the meantime, 42% of South Africans are unemployed. That's nearly 11 million people. Now don't blame the injured for the problems that exist in the society. Workers are the unfortunate recipients of bad policy choices and bad implementations. It's the elites and it's those in power and those who want to maintain their wealth, who want to keep black children out of white schools, who want to deny people opportunities. Those are the real enemies to economic growth. And that's the issues that we must challenge if we are to make progress in our country.
We're debating the South African economy, who's to blame for the crisis that we find ourselves in, and how do we chart a new course going forward. That will be the theme of our final segment. Stay with us after the break. We will address solutions. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're debating the South African economy. Let's go to some of your tweets. You've been participating in this conversation on social media. Hunter says the governing party is to blame for its failure to nationalize strategic sectors of the economy. Policies must be informed by the Freedom Charter, compromised at CODESA. Nothing has been transferred to the benefit of the people as a whole. Percival, the problem is that the ANC government was co-opted by big business. That's why we have ANC billionaires. And Tabiso says, it is both parties, ANC definitely, and the body made of other political parties, including most news ones. They do not hold ANC accountable and have focused on their selfish interests. EFF is the current confrontational hope, giving and real change the country needs. That's the last one. There are many different views on opposition parties. Mr. Ryder, as you'll see, we probably just got a selective tweet there, but I'm sure there are many people who believe your party has the solutions to take the country forward. If you were to pull one lever on the economy, what do you think is the longest lever that we have to rescue us from this crisis?
So the best possible thing that we can do is take the money that is given to government by the people, because the government doesn't have its own money, the government's got people's money. Take the money that people give to government and spend it on the people, honestly and with a good plan. Now, this has been demonstrated in places like the Western Cape, where we see people flocking from other parts of the country to move in and take up residence in the Western Cape. It's been seen locally, where I started my political career, in Midvaal, where people are seeing money spent on service delivery, on making sure that the economy thrives. And that is why we're seeing jobs growth in the Western Cape. That's why we're seeing infrastructural development in the Western Cape. That's why we're seeing people wanting to live there and do business in the Western Cape. The reality is that you can have as much conjecture as you like. The best predictor of future behavior is track record. And the Democratic Alliance has got the track record where we can proudly stand up and say, we govern well. No one can argue that point. We govern well. So the reality is that I believe that if we just hold government accountable, no matter which party is in government, we must have strong institutions. And here we find ourselves in a situation where for far too long, one party has had too much dominance in the political space. And I think that has been the biggest problem that we've had to date.
Mr. Ehrenreich, what do you think is the longest lever that we can pull to rescue ourselves from this economic crisis that we're in?
Well, I think the most important thing that we can do as a country is to make sure that we put more money into the pockets of working people. Because when working people go out and buy products with their income, they buy South African produced products, locally produced products. Mr. Ryder and his friends who run to the Western Cape, it's not because they weren't involved in the corruption around the building of the stadium, or they weren't paying people starvation wages on the N1 in the noon, and that's why we had a massive strike that nearly brought our economy to a halt. But it's that kind of greed and exploitation that I hear him saying it's okay and is a sign of good governance that is part of the biggest challenge. But back to my point about why it's important to put more money and to put decent wages into the pockets of working people, because they buy local products, which in turn stimulates the economy, stimulates local production. So companies are producing more, they're employing more, and that's how we grow the economy. Sure, we're going to grow it on the back of some exports, but the bulk of that growth is going to happen internally. And the fundamental requirement for that is to make sure that there's more disposable income in poorer communities. What we're doing at the moment, we're putting all the wealth, the disposable income, into the hands of the wealthy, those who already were empowered under apartheid. And what are they doing? They're buying Smeg toasters, R1 million cars, just the elite and the best of everything. Most of the time, those products are imported. So they have no loyalty or regard or solidarity to the rest of the South African population. All they want is to find a way to maintain the apartheid stolen privileges that they had, and to give some of that to their black friends who are now in powerful political positions so that they can defend those positions. We've got to make sure that we deal with the elites in our country, both black and white, so that people don't aspire to that, but you aspire to adding value, to creating jobs, to growing the economy, to exporting more, not thinking that you've got to have the biggest, brightest car at the private school when you drop off your child. It's about systemic changes that are required in our society, not just this kind of handouts to a few of your friends who think they're going to legitimate the economic structure that we have. So Hunter's point is absolutely correct. We compromised on the Freedom Charter and we let our people down as a consequence of that. But that's not unique to South Africa. That's happened in many of the bordering countries in South Africa where post-colonial struggles had seen the black leadership assimilate themselves into white lifestyles. We've got to craft a new lifestyle, a multiracial lifestyle, a multicultural, a multi-rainbow lifestyle where everybody has the opportunity for a decent standard of living and everybody has the opportunity to realize their potential and explore their ambitions. What we have now is just a system that's maintaining the wealth of those who stole and keeping the black communities out from accessing real opportunities to be able to grow our economy.
Mr. Monage, how do you respond to some of the proposals that have been made, but also from your unique vantage point from business? What would you say is the one lever we can pull to really get this economy into the dynamic mode that we all so yearn for?
So I think there are a number of things that we need to look at. Firstly, we need to redefine the economic dispensation that we admire or envision, all of us, because Post-1994, we have never defined the economy as a country to say what type of economy are we looking for. We only spoke about the political transformation. We never talk about the type of economy that we want. We don't have a clear economic vision as a country. The point that Tony raised, again, we are comparing ourselves with China. China, they have a long-term plan on the economic front. We don't have such a thing as a country. We don't have anything that as a country bring us together. We continue scoring our own goals in whatever form or shape. You then look at the things that we have done as a country. I mean, Dennis is talking about Western Cape, the worst place that continue to exclude black emerging companies, whether professionals or even small businesses. They're not part of the equation in Western Cape. And we cannot then pride ourselves that Cape Town or Western Cape is the best place to be. It's not. It's the worst place to be. Now, the point that I'm raising is the following, that we don't have a common vision on the economic dispensation to say what type of economy do we want. We then talk about the education system in the country. We don't have one common education. We have different types of education. We have private and we have public. We have a minister of education only responsible for government schools, not for private. So we have different standards. We don't have a clear vision in terms of bringing vocational training at hand. We're not even dealing with the communication as a country, as a society, to say what are the things that we're going to do in the next coming year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. We don't have such a thing. Now, part of the problem, again, we then look at the media, the role of media.
I'm going to have to stop. Every time you mention the media, I seem to stop you. It's not intentional, but Mr. Monache, as one of the country's leading voices in business, Mr. Ryder, you're one of the most eloquent opposition leaders on the economy from parliamentary benches, and Mr. Ehrenreich, as one of the veteran leaders of the trade union movement. We thank you for a fascinating conversation from multiple different perspectives on the economy. I benefited greatly, and we thank you very much for your time. I hope you got some insights into South Africa's economic malaise, our crisis, from multiple different perspectives. We had a fascinating and wide-ranging panel. Let's continue the conversation on social media. Let's meet on Twitter. Have a good night, and I look forward to you joining us for a further installment of Unfiltered later this week on Thursday. Till then, have a good evening.